pretend I'm your husband.
Grace. Miller's heart thundered in her chest beneath layers of white lace and satin. The ancient Italian church was bathed in golden candlelight, its high-arched ceiling painted with fading frescoes of saints and angels. Dozens of flickering candles lined the aisle, and the air smelled of incense and roses. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, her wedding day, yet an inexplicable dread coiled in her stomach. She stood at the marble altar facing the man she was about to marry, Ethan Caldwell, who smiled at her with what should have been reassuring warmth. Her father, Robert Miller, sat in the front pew to her right, dabbing tears of joy from his eyes. The pews were filled with elegant guests in suits and gowns. Everything was picture perfect, except Grace's hands were shaking around her bouquet of white lilies, and she didn't know why. The priest's voice echoed through the vast nave as he spoke in Italian, a language Grace only half understood. Her family was American. They had chosen Italy for the destination wedding of her dreams. A fairy tale venue for a fairy tale moment. So why did she feel a creeping unease, as if someone had walked over her grave? Grace tried to steady her breathing. It's just nerves, she told herself. Brides get nervous on their wedding day, right? But this felt different. Her skin prickled with an unseen tension. Over Ethan's shoulder, in the periphery of her vision, she thought she saw a dark figure, shifting in the shadows near a side entrance of the church. But when she glanced fully, nothing was there, just the flicker of candles against stone. Ethan gently squeezed her hands, drawing her attention back. His blue eyes searched hers. "You okay?" he mouthed silently, concern touching his expression. Grace forced a small smile and nodded. She must be imagining things. Ethan was a good man, charming, successful, everything she could hope for. Her father had introduced them a year ago, and though their courtship was whirlwind, she believed in their connection. This marriage would join two powerful families in business and hopefully love. The priest cleared his throat and continued the ceremony. Grace swallowed hard, glancing again at her father. Robert gave her a proud, misty-eyed smile and a thumbs up. It made her heart ache with affection. After losing Mom years ago, it had just been her and Dad. Today was as important to him as it was to her. I should be happy, she reminded herself. I will be happy. She inhaled deeply, catching the scent of the roses arranged in towering bouquets around the altar. The organist played softly in the background. Ethan's grip on her hands was warm and steady. She felt the eyes of everyone on them, waiting for the vows. Se qualcuno conosce una ragione per cui questi due non dovrebbero essere uniti in sacro matrimonio, parli ora o taccia per sempre, the priest invited, his tone solemn. Grace recognized that phrase, speak now or forever hold your peace. A tiny, nervous laugh almost escaped her at the cliché moment. Of course, no one ever actually objected in real life. She risked another quick glance around the church, her gaze skimming over the sea of faces, the candles casting dancing shadows on carved stone pillars. Nothing was amiss. Everyone was smiling expectantly. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church creaked. Grace's head turned involuntarily. A tall figure slipped inside, backlit by the dusk light. He was dressed in a tailored black suit, moving with a predatory grace down the aisle. Grace squinted, heart skipping. He was not one of the invited guests. She knew that at once. His stride was too confident, too purposeful, as if he owned the place. As he came closer, passing row after row of stunned guests, the dim light revealed a face made of sharp angles, strong jaw, high cheekbones, and eyes that gleamed like steel. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Robert Miller rose halfway to his feet in confusion. Grace felt Ethan's hands tense around hers. The priest paused, words faltering in the echoing silence. The stranger reached the front, just a few steps from the altar, and for a moment Grace forgot how to breathe. The man was devastatingly handsome in a fierce, arresting way. Dark hair, a few locks falling across his forehead. Broad shoulders filling out that expensive suit. There was an aura of danger around him that sent a jolt of both fear and something inexplicably electric through Grace. She had never seen him before, yet something about his presence felt larger than life, and deeply ominous. "Mi scusi," the priest addressed the intruder nervously. "Posso aiutarla?" This is a private ceremony. Before the priest could finish, the man moved with startling swiftness. In a blur, he stepped right up to Grace. Ethan tried to interpose himself, brow furrowed in anger. "Hey, what do you think?" Ethan began. But the dark-suited stranger was faster. Grace gasped as the stranger brushed past. Ethan and suddenly was at her side, impossibly close. She caught the scent of his cologne, wood smoke, and spice. A strong arm snaked around her waist possessively. It happened so quickly. She couldn't react. She was pulled firmly against the stranger's side. Several guests audibly gasped. "What on earth?" Ethan blurted, reaching for Grace's arm. In that same instant, Grace felt something cold and metallic press against her side. Hidden between their bodies. A gun. Her pulse spiked in pure terror. He had a gun pressed discreetly against her ribs. Grace's mind reeled. Was this a robbery? A kidnapping? Fear flashed in Ethan's eyes now, and he backed up, hands half raised as if unsure what the man might do. Robert took a step into the aisle, panic on his face. "Nobody move," the stranger said quietly, his voice a low, calm command that somehow cut through the rising commotion like thunder. Grace felt the rumble of it against her cheek, where it was nearly pressed to his chest. His accent was American, surprisingly. In the shocked silence that followed, only the echo of his words remained, ringing off the stone walls. Grace's entire body was rigid with fright. The barrel of the gun nudged her side as a reminder of her peril. She could hardly turn her head. But from the corner of her eye she glimpsed two more, men in dark suits appearing at the doorway. At the back of the church, they stood like sentinels, blocking exit. Were they with him? Her blood ran cold. The stranger bent his head down so his lips were nearly touching Grace's ear. She felt the warmth of his breath as he whispered, so softly only she could hear, "You're in danger. Pretend I'm your husband." Grace's breath caught. Her eyes went wide. What? For a fraction of a second, the world stopped. Her racing thoughts couldn't make sense of his words. "Pretend I'm your husband?" She tried to speak, but no sound came out. The stranger's arm tightened subtly around her waist, supporting her trembling form. He continued in that same low murmur meant just for her. "I'm here to help you. There are people here who want to hurt you. Grace, trust me if you want to live. Hurt me?" Her heart hammered. From the pews, a few frightened murmurs grew louder. The guests were bewildered at this intrusion, at the sight of the bride seemingly in the arms of another man with a gun. Ethan's face had gone pale, his jaw clenched as though calculating his next move. The priest stepped back in alarm, clutching his Bible. Grace fought through the panic fogging her mind. She didn't know this man, yet he knew her name. And he said she was in danger. The glint in his steel-gray eyes and the firmness in his voice told her he meant it. Despite the gun, despite the terror of this moment, something in his tone, urgent, protecting, made her believe him. From the corner of her eye, Grace noticed one of the side doors of the church opening a crack. A face peered in, another man in a suit, eyes scanning the scene. Then another door at the opposite end creaked. Realization struck her. The church was being surrounded. Not just by this one man, but others too. Possibly many others. Ethan apparently noticed too. "Security!" he shouted suddenly, voice echoing. He turned toward the congregation. "Someone call the police!" At that shout, pandemonium erupted. Guests leapt from their seats. Some screamed. Grace heard her father yelling her name. Saw him trying to push past panicked people into the aisle. The two men at the main doors drew handguns, sending the crowd into further hysterics. A woman shrieked. People began scrambling under pews or dropping to the floor. Grace's instinct screamed at her to run, to hide. But the stranger's arm held her firmly in place. She felt him pivot, sheltering her with his own body as a sudden bang cracked through the air. Gunfire, plaster, dust rained from a new bullet hole in the ceiling. Someone had fired a shot into the air to seize control. It might have been one of the intruders at the door. "Quiet," a voice barked from the back. The chaos dulled to whimpers and silence. Grace's ears rang from the gunshot's echo. She clutched the stranger's suit jacket with her free hand, her knuckles white around her bouquet in the other. Every muscle in her body quivered in terror. At the entrance of the church, a stocky man with a shaved head stepped forward, a pistol raised toward the ceiling. He scanned the room with cold predator eyes. "Nobody leaves," he growled. "Stay in your seats and you won't get hurt." Grace's heart plunged. This was an attack, but why? Who were these people? She struggled to think past the fear. The man holding her, had he anticipated this? Was he one of them or someone separate? He had said he was here to help her, told her to pretend he was her husband. At the thought, she realized that he still held her like a groom might hold a bride protectively. His stance was tall and unwavering, shielding her partly from view. With a sinking feeling, Grace wondered if he might be using her as a human shield. But his earlier whisper, there had been genuine urgency, even concern in it. Not a threat. Let her go, Ethan demanded, eyes flicking anxiously from the armed men to the stranger who held Grace. Ethan looked as frightened as she felt, but he took a step toward them. Who are you? What do you want? The stranger, the one claiming to be helping her, answered in a voice so icy it sent a chill down Grace's spine. Stay back or you'll only make this worse. Ethan halted. Anger and fear warred on his face. Grace realized the stranger hadn't directly answered who he was or what he wanted. Instead, he seemed focused on the other gunman now, eyes narrowed. From the aisle, Robert spoke up, voice shaking but determined. Please let my daughter go. If it's money you want, Mr. Miller, is it? Another voice boomed from the vestibule. Grace turned her head, just enough to see a tall, older man emerge from behind the shaved-head thug at the door. This man wore a light gray suit and had silver at his temples, exuding an air of authority. He strode in with casual confidence, like this was his event now. A cruel smile spread on his lips as he surveyed the frightened guests and then locked eyes with Robert. No one's going anywhere until we have a little chat. Grace felt the stranger, holding her stiffen. His grip on her waist shifted almost imperceptibly, positioning himself more between her and the new arrival. Did he recognize that man? Robert stepped into the aisle shakily. Conrad? He murmured, recognition and betrayal in his tone. What is the meaning of this? Conrad. Grace's stomach lurched. Conrad Caldwell, Ethan's father. She had met him just twice. Both times he had seemed polite, if a bit distant. He was supposed to be their ally. After all, this marriage was also a business alliance with his family's powerful corporation. Why would he be here now, armed men in tow? Dad! Ethan exclaimed, surprise evident. What are you doing? Ethan's face had gone sheet white, but Conrad ignored his son for the moment. Robert, Conrad tutted, stepping leisurely further down the aisle. Two more goons trailed behind him, guns in hand. Conrad's eyes flicked to Grace and the man who held her, and a slight frown crossed his face. He didn't seem to have expected the stranger's presence either. Grace's voice trembled as she found it. Mr. Caldwell, I don't understand. Her wedding day had descended into a nightmare. The father of the groom arriving like a mobster with armed men? Was this even real? Conrad's smile returned, oily and dripping false sympathy. I'm sorry, my dear, truly, but this wedding can't go forward. Not when your father has something that belongs to me. His tone hardened. On the last sentence, Robert's eyes blazed. We've done everything you asked, Conrad. Our merger, the partnership, this marriage, everything. You said you'd let us be if I got what I wanted. Yes, Conrad interrupted coldly. But you've been holding out on me. Did you think I wouldn't find out? He gestured subtly. One of his men moved toward Robert, grabbing his arm. No, Grace cried, instinctively pulling away from the stranger's grasp to go to her father. The stranger's arm flexed, keeping her in place. Dad! She screamed as Robert struggled against the thug's hold. Ethan looked at his father in horror and confusion. What is he talking about? Dad, what is going on? Ethan edged toward Conrad, but one of the armed men stepped between, warning him back. It dawned on Grace that Ethan might truly have no idea what his father was doing. His shock seemed genuine. Conrad cast his son a withering glance. Stay out of this. Ethan, I told you to do your part and marry the girl, that's all. I'll handle the rest. Grace's blood ran cold. The world blurred around her, narrowing to Conrad's words. I told you to do your part and marry the girl. She turned her gaze to Ethan, dread twisting her insides. Ethan? She whispered, her voice broken. Ethan shook his head vehemently. Grace, I didn't know he would... He stammered. Conrad barked a humorless laugh. Oh, don't lie to her now, son. Not here at the end. He sighed as if disappointed. Ethan knew very well, my dear. We needed this union to gain access to your father's company assets and, well, other leverage. The plan was to secure those things quietly through marriage. But then your father got nervous and hid something important from me. Something that could ruin everything. Conrad's face darkened, his polite facade slipping to reveal cold menace. I can't tolerate betrayal. So here we are. Grace felt like the ground had vanished beneath her. She might have collapsed if not for the steely arm around her waist propping her up. Her beloved fiancé. Was this saying he'd only been using her all along? That their love was a lie orchestrated by Conrad for business gains? Her eyes brimmed with tears of shock and devastation. "Grace, listen to me," Ethan pleaded, trying to step forward. But now the stranger holding her leveled his own gun. When had he drawn it? Directly at Ethan's chest. Ethan halted, trembling hands partially raised. The stranger's voice was deadly calm. "That's far enough, groom." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Grace could scarcely process who was on whose side. The stranger who crashed. Her wedding clearly wasn't working for Conrad. He was now aiming at Ethan as if protecting her from her own fiancé. Conrad's eyes narrowed at the dark-haired interloper. "And who?" Conrad asked in a silken, dangerous tone. "Might you be, sir? This is a family matter. I don't recall inviting you." The man at Grace's side finally spoke up, louder now for all to hear. "Alexander Knight. And I'm afraid I can't just sit by and watch you hurt the lady." A stunned silence fell. Grace felt everyone's eyes on them. Alexander Knight? She didn't recognize the name immediately, but Conrad clearly did. A flicker of surprise, maybe even fear, crossed the older man's features. "Knight?" Conrad said with a slight sneer, masking his reaction quickly. "I should have known. The infamous American Mafia boss meddling in my affairs. How touching that you'd crash a wedding to play hero." He chuckled darkly. "But you're out of your league, boy. This is between me and the Millers. Walk away, and I might forget I saw you here." Grace's stomach flipped. "Mafia boss? This Alexander Knight?" She found herself tilting, her head to look up at the man who held her. Really? Looking at him for the first time since this madness began. His jaw was set hard, his gaze fixed on Conrad with lethal intensity. There was a storm behind his steel-gray eyes, a contained fury. He radiated the kind of power and confidence that could only come from someone used to being feared. And Conrad had called him infamous. Yet here he was, shielding her. Why? Alexander's hold on Grace gentled for a brief second as his eyes flickered to her. "Keep your head down," he murmured to her under his breath. And then his lips curved in a ghost of a sardonic smile aimed at Conrad. "I don't walk away from a party I've already crashed, Mr. Caldwell. And certainly not when a lady's safety is on the line." Conrad's face hardened. He snapped to the thug restraining Robert. "Find the documents. Bring me what he took now." Then he waved a hand toward a couple of his other men, pointing at Alexander and Grace. "And get my future daughter-in-law away from that man." Time itself seemed to splinter. 3 things happened at once. Conrad's goons started advancing down the aisle. Ethan lunged forward as if to grab Grace, or perhaps to placate her. And Alexander Knight moved. He shifted in front of Grace fully, pushing her behind him as his arm extended, gun trained steadily on the approaching henchman. "Grace, get down!" he ordered. She dropped into a low crouch behind him without thinking, adrenaline finally propelling her to action. Her wedding gown poofed around her. She ripped the long veil from her head so she could see. Heart in her throat, she peered around Alexander's solid form. "Don't you dare hurt her," Ethan shouted. But it was impossible to tell if he was yelling at Alexander or his father's men. Ethan had produced a handgun. 2, Grace had no idea he even carried one, and had it shakily aimed at Alexander. But he looked torn, eyes darting between his father's men and his bride. He was in over his head. Before anyone could respond, the crack of gunfire exploded in the holy space. Conrad's men opened fire at Alexander, marble chipped and shattered as bullets struck a column inches from Alexander's shoulder. Some guests screamed anew, cowering behind pews. Alexander pivoted smoothly, wrapping one arm around Grace as he fired back with deadly precision. 1, 2 shots. 2 of Conrad's advancing thugs crumpled to the ground, weapons clattering on the stone floor. Grace flinched at each blast from the pistol so close to her ear. But Alexander shielded her from return fire, his body an unyielding barrier. Ethan yelped and hit the floor to avoid the crossfire. Conrad ducked behind a pew, snarling. The church erupted into chaos again, frightened guests crawling away, the organist hiding behind his instrument, the priest praying aloud in frantic Latin from somewhere near the altar steps. Grace clung to Alexander's back, her fingers twisting into his jacket reflexively. The acrid scent of gunpowder filled the air, stinging her nose. She couldn't believe this was happening. Gunfights in a church, at her wedding. Another of Conrad's men tried to flank them from the side aisle. Alexander saw the motion. He spun, sweeping Grace low to the ground with him in a swift motion, just as a hail of bullets whizzed overhead, punching through an old wooden pew with a splintering crash. In a blur, Alexander returned fire. The gunman cried out and fell backwards, clutching his arm, dropping his weapon. For a heartbeat, it seemed the attackers were stunned by the ferocity of Alexander's defense. Conrad's men hesitated, dragging their wounded aside. Alexander used the brief lull. He leaned down to Grace, his face dangerously close to hers. "We have to get out of here," he said, voice taut. Grace nodded rapidly, her pulse racing. She trusted him now, the way he was. Protecting her left little doubt. Whose side he was on? "My father?" she gasped, eyes darting to where Robert had been. She saw him near the front pew, wrestling with the thug who still had hold of him. Robert elbowed the man hard, momentarily freeing himself. Robert locked eyes with Grace across the mayhem. "Go!" he shouted at her hoarsely. "Go with him, Grace, run!" The thug immediately grappled Robert into submission again, pistol pressed to his temple. Grace screamed, lurching forward, but Alexander's arm barred her path. He gripped her shoulders firmly. "I'll come back for him. But if they get you, it's over. We need to move now." Tears streamed down Grace's face. She hated leaving her father behind. But Alexander was right. As long as Conrad wanted her for leverage, she couldn't help her father by getting caught too. And Robert, with whatever strength he had, clearly wanted her safe first. Alexander's jaw clenched. "Follow me. Stay low." She swallowed her sobs and mustered every ounce of courage, nodding. "Okay." Alexander pivoted and fired, 2 covering shots towards the remaining men near the door, forcing them to duck. Then, keeping his body between Grace and the threats, he pulled her along quickly. They moved in a crouch along the side of the altar. Grace gathered her heavy skirts, trying not to trip. Her legs were shaking so badly she nearly stumbled on the first step down from the dais. Ethan's voice echoed from somewhere behind them, panicked. "Grace! Wait, Grace!" She glanced back for 1 second and saw Ethan kneeling beside one of the fallen goons, torn between chasing her and fearing the bullets flying. Their eyes met. Hers were full of hurt and confusion, his filled with regret. Or was it just fear for himself? That hesitation told her everything. Ethan had made his choice. Alexander tugged her onward sharply. Grace forced herself to look, away from Ethan, from the wreckage of what was supposed to be her perfect day, and focus on survival. They slipped behind a column as Conrad's men regained their aggression. Bullets pelted the column's far side, fragments of stone exploding. Alexander winced as a shard grazed his cheek, but he kept moving, arm tight around Grace's shoulders as he shielded her. He was leading her toward a small side door at the front of the church, one used perhaps by choir or clergy. One of Conrad's thugs stepped into their path, emerging seemingly from nowhere among the side pews. The man raised his weapon at point-blank range, a triumphant grin on his scarred face. Grace's heart seized in her throat. Alexander was faster. In a single motion, he pushed Grace behind him and launched himself at the gunman. A deafening shot rang out. The thug fired, but Alexander had struck his arm upward. The bullet went wild, shattering a stained glass window overhead in a rain of colored shards. Alexander drove his elbow into the man's face with bone-crunching force. The attacker crumpled, unconscious or worse. Grace realized she had stopped breathing. She gasped for air and stared at Alexander in astonishment. He had just disarmed a man with his bare hands in the blink of an eye. Who was this man who fought like a one-man army? No time to wonder. Alexander retrieved the fallen thug's gun with his free hand, now dual-wielding firearms. He kicked open the side door, a blast of cool evening air sweeping in. Outside, the sky was painted with the purples of twilight. The narrow door opened into a small side courtyard enclosed by a wrought iron fence. Beyond it lay a quiet cobblestone alley. Alexander scanned for hostiles, guns raised, then pulled Grace through. "This way," he urged, guiding her toward a gap in the fence where part of the iron railing had been pried, loose, likely his point of entry. They squeezed through just as shouts arose behind them. "They're getting away," someone bellowed from inside the church. A bullet pinged off the iron bars inches from Grace, causing her to yelp and duck. The moment they were clear of the fence, Alexander grabbed her hand and broke into a run. Grace hitched up her gown, kicking off her delicate white heels without a second thought. They clattered on the cobblestones, as she sprinted barefoot to keep up with his long strides. Another shot rang out, then another, thudding into the wall of the church as they tore down the alley. Their silhouettes must have been visible against the courtyard lights. Alexander yanked her around a corner sharply, into an even narrower passage between old stone buildings. Here it was nearly dark, only a faint glow from a distant street lamp guiding them. They kept running. Grace's lungs burned, adrenaline barely numbing the pain of gravel digging into her feet. The elaborate wedding dress she wore was cumbersome, the train tangling. With an impatient grunt, she gathered the skirt and ripped the lower half of it away, Tulin silk tearing in her fists. The heavy fabric dropped away behind her, freeing her legs to move more easily. The very thought would have terrified her hours ago, but after seeing Ethan and Conrad's betrayal, Alexander was the only person in the world she felt she could trust at this moment. The burly guard interrupted gruffly. "Boss, there's a car waiting at the end of the tunnel. We gotta move. Caldwell's men will swarm the streets soon." Alexander nodded. All business once more. He released Grace's hand reluctantly. "We'll talk later," he said to her, voice low but reassuring. Then he motioned for her to follow. Grace straightened, wiping her eyes, forcing composure. Okay. She wasn't about to fall apart now, not when her father's life hung in the balance and armed killers were after her. Later, she'd break down from the shock and heartbreak of Ethan's deception, if later even came. Now she had to survive. Alexander and the guard led her down the corridor which sloped downward. Apparently an old passageway between buildings. It was damp and narrow, lit only by a single flickering bulb. As they hurried through, Grace's mind raced nearly as fast as her feet. Her wedding was ruined. Her fiancé was complicit in some plot against her family. Her father was in enemy hands, and everything she thought she knew had been upended in the span of minutes. The tears pricked at her again, but she blinked them back fiercely. Focus. She had to focus on getting through this. She looked at Alexander's back as he guided them. Who was this man who had appeared out of nowhere to protect her? A Mafia boss, Conrad had said. But why would he help her? What stake did he have in this nightmare? There would be time for answers soon, she hoped. If Alexander Knight truly meant to keep his word, then maybe, just maybe, she had a chance to save her father and come out of this alive. And if he didn't, if this was all just some deeper game, then she was already doomed. Grace took a shuddering breath, steadying herself on the cold stone wall as they turned another corner. Alexander caught her gaze over his shoulder. Not much farther, he assured softly. She gave a determined nod. She would follow him for now. She would trust him. What other choice did she have? In the labyrinthine darkness under the ancient streets of Italy, Grace Miller clung to the only light left in her shattered world. The man who had whispered at the altar that he was her husband, and who, against all odds, had become her protector. The corridor eventually opened into an underground garage. A sleek black sedan idled there, headlights off. Another of Alexander's men stood by the open back door, alert. The second Grace slid into the car's back seat. Alexander followed right behind, slamming the door. Go, he ordered the driver. With a squeal of tires on concrete, the car sped up a ramp and out into the night. Grace peered through the tinted back window. For an instant, she caught a view of the church's bell tower a few blocks away, lit by floodlights, and the wail of distant sirens finally cut through the air. Someone must have called the police at some point, but it was too late for them to stop what had already happened. The church grew smaller as they turned a corner, and then it was gone. Grace faced forward with a shaky exhale. The interior of the sedan was dim, illuminated only by the glow of the dashboard. The driver, the burly guard from before, navigated the narrow Italian streets with practiced urgency. Alexander sat beside Grace in the back, one arm protectively draped across the seat behind her as he looked out the windows for any sign of pursuit. For a long moment, neither Alexander nor Grace spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and Grace's own heartbeat thudding in her ears. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling. She clenched them in her lap to hide it, bunching the tattered remnants of her satin skirt between her fingers. It was Alexander who finally broke the silence. We should be clear of them for now. He turned his head to look at her, and in the passing glow of a street lamp she saw concern etched on his face. How are you holding up? Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. How was she? Her wedding day had turned to blood and bullets. Her father was kidnapped. Her fiancé, a painful lump formed in her throat. Her fiancé had betrayed her. All under an hour ago. She felt like a living wound, raw and exposed. But she was alive. Thanks to this man. I'm not sure, she admitted, voice unsteady. This doesn't feel real. Her eyes burned with tears she was tired of shedding. She blinked them away stubbornly. My father, they have him. The words tasted like poison. Alexander's jaw tightened. We'll get him back, Grace. She looked at him, searching his face. Why? Why are you helping us? Who are you, really? The questions tumbled out, quiet but urgent. You said your name is Alexander Knight. I heard Conrad call you a Mafia boss. I don't understand any of this. I don't even know if I should trust you. Her voice caught, and she added in a whisper, but I don't have anyone else. Alexander's gaze softened at that. He shifted slightly toward her, lowering his arm from the seat to around her shoulders in a loose half-embrace. The gesture was surprisingly gentle, almost instinctive, as if he wanted to reassure her with his presence. Grace didn't pull away. Oddly, being close to him made her feel safer. You're right to have questions, he said quietly, and you don't have to trust me blindly. But I hope you will, at least until your father is safe. He paused, considering his words. Your father and I have a mutual enemy in Conrad Caldwell. Grace absorbed that. You know my father? Did he ask you to come? Alexander nodded once. Robert reached out to me a few days ago. He had discovered that Conrad's business empire wasn't as legitimate as it seemed. Your father was worried. He suspected Conrad might try something drastic if he didn't hand over certain sensitive documents, evidence of Conrad's crimes. I believe. Grace's eyes widened. The documents Conrad mentioned at the church. That's what this is about? He's doing all of this for paperwork? Paperwork that could land him in prison for life, Alexander clarified. Apparently your father got hold of financial records and a list of names that Conrad has been desperate to hide. Conrad likely wanted Ethan to get access to your father's files quietly after the marriage. But when your father hid them instead, Conrad decided to use force. Grace's stomach churned. With anger and disbelief, her father had known something was wrong and tried to protect her, even using her wedding as bait in a sense while safeguarding those documents. And Ethan, how much had Ethan known? Did Ethan know about these documents too? She asked haltingly. Alexander's lip curled slightly. I don't think he knew all the details. Conrad doesn't share power or information easily, even with his son. But Ethan knew this marriage was not purely for love. He hesitated before, adding in a lower tone, I'm sorry. Grace, I know that's painful to hear. Grace pressed her hands against her eyes, willing away the tears threatening to fall. She refused to cry about Ethan anymore. Not now. She dropped her hands and straightened, clinging to facts. So my father contacted you. Why are you... She swallowed. Really a mafia boss? The corners of Alexander's mouth twitched, as if that amused him, despite the dark situation. Depends who you ask, he said. I run certain business operations both in the States and Europe. To some, that makes me a criminal. To others, a necessary ally. He didn't shy away from the label. She noticed, but neither did he flaunt it. Grace thought of the way Conrad had spoken his name with wariness. Conrad clearly knows you. Are you rivals? In a manner of speaking, Alexander replied, a shadow crossing his face at Conrad's name. We've never met in person before today, but our interests have clashed. He's wanted to expand his influence in ways that threaten mine. I wasn't about to let him gain the Miller assets and whatever leverage those documents give. When your father came for help, I saw a chance to stop Conrad's plans and do some good in the process. He said the last part almost self-mockingly, as if doing good wasn't something he often prioritized. Grace studied his profile in the dark car. Alexander Knight remained a mystery. But one thing was clear. Without him stepping in, she'd likely be Conrad's prisoner now, or worse. Maybe he had his own agenda, but he'd saved her life when he could have just looked the other way. Alexander shifted, suppressing a small wince as the car bounced over uneven cobbles. Grace remembered his injury. In all the tumult, he'd brushed it off, but he was still bleeding. You're hurt, she said softly, nodding to his arm. Alexander raised a brow at her bare feet and the cuts visible on her ankles. Not severely, maybe, but you're bleeding. Grace looked down. Adrenaline had masked the sting of the scrapes on her feet and along her arms where she likely got grazed by debris. Now that he pointed it out, An uncomfortable burning made itself known. In the chaos, she hadn't even noticed thin trickles of blood mixing with dirt on her skin. "Oh," she said softly, feeling a little faint at the sight. "It's nothing, I'll be fine." Alexander frowned slightly. "I admire the bravery, but you've been through hell. Let someone take care of you." The gentleness in his voice nearly unraveled her composure. It had been so long since someone had taken care of her. She was always trying to be the composed daughter, the dutiful fiancée. Now here she was, barefoot and bloodied in a getaway car, her life in ruins, and this dangerous, caring stranger was looking at her like she mattered. The urge to cry swelled up again. She bit it back fiercely, nodding. "Okay," she whispered. True to Alexander's word, within minutes the sedan pulled into a secluded driveway behind a high stone wall. The property looked like an old villa on the outskirts of town, with ivy-covered walls and shuttered windows that revealed nothing of what lay inside. The driver spoke quietly into a radio in Italian. The heavy iron gates creaked open and they slipped inside. They drove into a covered garage. Grace saw 2 more cars and even a motorcycle parked within. As soon as the sedan stopped, Alexander was out and at her side, offering his hand to help her from the back seat. She took it, grateful for the steadiness of his grip as her legs trembled when she stood. In the garage's brighter light, Alexander looked grim. There was some blood on his cheek from a small cut, and his suit was a dusty, torn mess, not to mention the bullet graze on his arm. Grace realized she probably looked just as frightful or worse, wedding hair in disarray, makeup streaked with tears, the once beautiful bridal gown shredded and stained with soot and grime. A sudden self-consciousness made her wrap an arm around herself. This morning she had been a pristine bride. Now she felt like a ghost of herself. Alexander's eyes softened as they traveled over her, reading her distress. "You're safe here," he said softly, as if that was the only thing that mattered. "Come on. Let's get inside and get you cleaned up." Grace managed a small nod. He gently guided her through a side door into the villa. Inside the safe house was a surprisingly cozy space. Nothing like a hideout for criminals she might have imagined. Warm lamplight lit a living area with comfortable leather, sofas, and a brick fireplace. A large wooden table was strewn with maps and papers. Standing by the table were 2 men who looked up sharply at their entry. "Mr. Knight," one exclaimed, relief evident. He was older, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and a stern face. The other was a younger man with sharp eyes and a laptop under his arm. "Any trouble, boss?" the younger one asked. Then his gaze fell on Grace, and his eyebrows shot up at the sight of her torn bridal attire and disheveled state. Alexander kept a possessive yet respectful hand at the small of Grace's back. Conrad's men made a move at the church, as expected. "We got out with Grace, but Robert Miller was taken." His tone was clipped, all business again in front of his men. The older man cursed under his breath. "We heard the commotion over the police bands. Are either of you hurt?" "A scratch," Alexander said dismissively, though Grace could tell his arm wound was more than that. "Grace has a few cuts. Where's Marcus?" "Here," came a voice from another doorway. A tall man in a navy sweater stepped into the room, phone in hand. He had a lean build and calculating eyes. Grace felt an inexplicable prickle run over her skin at his gaze. Perhaps it was just that he appeared in a rush and had a somewhat intense stare. "I was just on the line with our lookout downtown. They saw Caldwell's men swarming the hotel your team was monitoring. Seems Caldwell's cleaning up any evidence in the city. They're definitely hunting you two." Alexander nodded. "All business. They don't find this place. Not easily, at least." He turned to Grace, gently introducing the men. "This is Thomas," he motioned to the gray-haired man, "my chief of security." Then to the tech-carrying younger man, "Ryan, our communications expert." And the last, "Marcus, my second-in-command." Grace mustered a polite nod to each, feeling suddenly shy and out of place under their scrutiny. She was very aware of how she looked, a bride ripped from her wedding, now thrust into the midst of what seemed like a small private army's headquarters. Thomas stepped forward kindly. "Miss Miller, I can't imagine what you've gone through. We're at your service. Anything you need, you let us know." "Thank you," Grace replied quietly. The normalcy of his politeness almost made her want to weep again. "Marcus," Alexander said, "double the perimeter guards and get someone you trust to watch the road for any suspicious vehicles. Caldwell might try to follow any leads here if he gets desperate." "On it." Marcus responded efficiently. He gave Grace a brief once-over, something in his look hard to decipher, then strode out through the garage door to carry out orders, phone already pressed to his ear. Grace let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Now that the immediate flight and fight were over, a crushing exhaustion settled on her shoulders. Her adrenaline was crashing, leaving her dizzy and weak. Alexander noticed. He kept a supportive hand under her elbow. "Thomas, have a medic kit brought to the guest room. And see if we have any suitable clothes for Miss Miller to change into." "Yes, boss." Thomas beckoned to Ryan, who put down his laptop and hurried off into another hall, presumably to fetch supplies. Alexander guided Grace gently down a corridor away from the main gathering area. With each step, her adrenaline ebbed, and the reality of all she'd lost pressed heavier. She stumbled, her vision blurring with tears despite her fight to hold them back. Alexander paused outside a bedroom door, turning to her. Without a word, he brought his hands to either side of her arms, steadying her. His eyes searched her face. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're safe." That simple assurance undid the last of her composure. A sob escaped Grace's throat. "My dad, I left him," she choked out. Alexander moved with a sudden impulse, wrapping her fully in his arms. The embrace was firm and warm, one hand cradling the back of her head as she finally broke. Grace buried her face against his chest and let the sobs come, her fists clinging to his shirt. He said nothing, just held her through it, his chin resting atop her head. She felt his heartbeat against her cheek, strong and steady, grounding her in the storm of anguish. After a minute, Grace managed to gasp, "I'm sorry, I don't usually cry like this." "Don't apologize," Alexander said, his deep voice rumbling through her. "After what you went through today, you've earned a few tears." There was a touch of wry gentleness in his tone. Grace pulled back slightly, looking up at him. He kept his arms loosely around her, as if unwilling to let go until he was sure she wouldn't collapse. She realized how intimate their stance was and flushed, hastily wiping her wet cheeks. But Alexander didn't seem bothered. If anything, he looked concerned and tender. "I promise you," he said softly, lifting one hand to brush a strand of hair from her tear-streaked face. "I will do everything in my power to save your father and make Conrad pay for what he's done. You're not alone in this." Grace's breath caught. No one had ever looked at her with such fierce resolve on her behalf. In Ethan's eyes at the altar, she'd seen fear and regret, but not this unwavering determination. In that moment, something cracked open in her heart, a cautious hope. "Thank you, Alexander," she whispered. He nodded, then gently released her. "Let's get you settled. You need rest." He opened the door to the guest room, revealing a cozy space with a large bed and an attached bathroom. Grace stepped inside, swaying slightly on her aching feet. Alexander hovered at the threshold, as if debating whether to leave her alone or not. Before he could decide, Thomas arrived with a bulky first aid kit and a folded set of clothes. He handed them to Alexander. "Boss, I brought sweats and a shirt. Probably big on her, but comfortable. And here's the med kit. Ryan's making some hot tea and a bit of food, too, if Miss Miller can manage to eat." Grace's stomach twisted at the mention of food. She wasn't sure she could swallow a bite, but she appreciated the gesture. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, offering a faint smile of gratitude. He nodded and withdrew tactfully. Alexander stepped inside, setting the supplies on the foot of the bed. He hesitated only a moment. "Do you need any help, or would you prefer privacy to change?" Grace glanced down at her ruined wedding dress. The idea of peeling it off by herself, along with everything it represented, felt overwhelming. But having Alexander assist felt unthinkable, even if modesty was the last thing she cared about right now. "I can manage, I think," she said, though her voice wavered. He gave her space with a respectful dip of his head. "I'll be right outside if you need anything. Call out, okay?" "Okay." With that, Alexander withdrew and closed the door, leaving Grace alone for the first time since the ceremony. The silence pressed in. Grace caught a glimpse of herself in the dresser mirror and winced. A pale, wide-eyed ghost of a bride stared back. Her once elegantly braided brunette hair was tangled, veil gone, a small cut on her forehead from flying debris. Her mascara had run, leaving dark smudges beneath red-rimmed eyes. The white gown hung off her in dirty, torn strips. She hardly recognized herself. Gently, she worked the dress's bodice open, fingers fumbling with the tiny pearl buttons. Each pop felt like a release from a life that no longer existed. When it was loose enough, she let the entire heavy garment fall to the floor. Underneath, she wore only thin lace bridal lingerie, now marred with dust. A harsh reminder of how this day was meant to end. Married, in love, in her husband's arms. Instead, Grace shut her eyes, steadying herself. Don't spiral, not now. Focus on the present. She was alive, safe for the moment. And there were people willing to fight for her and her father. She quickly pulled on the clothes. Thomas brought a black t-shirt and gray drawstring sweatpants. As predicted, they were too large. The pants cinched tight at her waist and still slipped a bit, and the shirt's shoulder seams hung off her arms. But the softness of clean fabric and the subtle scent of detergent was a small comfort against her skin. She felt a twinge of relief to shed the tatters of the wedding dress, as though taking off a heavy weight. Grace sat on the bed and opened the medical kit. There were antiseptic wipes, bandages, and other supplies. Her hands shook as she reached for a wipe to dab at a cut on her foot. The door creaked open slightly. Alexander's voice floated through gently. Is everything all right? May I come in? Grace realized she probably should have locked it if she wanted privacy, but she hadn't even thought to. Strangely, she didn't feel unsafe with him at all. You can come in, she replied. He stepped inside, eyes immediately finding her figure in the baggy clothes. Something unreadable flickered in his expression, but he masked it. Grace saw he had removed his torn suit jacket and tie, leaving him in a white dress shirt, sleeves stained with blood, and dark slacks. The top few buttons of his shirt were undone, and for the first time, she noticed a thin silver chain around his neck, disappearing under the fabric. He had rolled up his sleeves, likely to examine his wound, revealing strong forearms. He carried a steaming mug in one hand and a plate, with some bread and cheese in the other. Ryan's attempt at catering, he said with a tiny smile. Thought you might want something warm to drink at least. It's just chamomile tea. Grace accepted the mug gratefully, wrapping her hands around it. The warmth was soothing. Thank you. She took a small sip. It was fragrant and calming, easing some of the chill inside her. Alexander set the plate on the nightstand. I know food might be the last thing on your mind, but try to eat a little. You need strength. Grace picked up a slice of the bread to be polite and nibbled it. Her stomach was still roiling, but the mild flavor was actually welcome after the bitter taste of fear all night. Alexander sat beside her on the bed, a careful distance so as not to crowd her. He took the first aid kit, his brow knitting as he saw her attempting to clean the cut on her foot. Let me help with that. Before she could protest, he gently took her ankle in his hand, lifting her foot onto his knee. Grace's breath caught at the intimate gesture, but Alexander's focus was purely on tending the wound. With tender precision, he dabbed at the scrape with a fresh antiseptic wipe. It stung, and she hissed involuntarily. Sorry, he murmured, blowing softly on the cleaned cut like one might for a child's scrape. The sting subsided, replaced by a tingle at the gentle cool of his breath. Grace found her lips curving faintly. You're surprisingly good at this, she said. Alexander glanced up and gave a half smile. I've had some practice patching people up. Hazard of the life I lead. That reminded Grace of his own injury. You should do your arm too. It looks bad. He shrugged, finishing bandaging her foot. It's really not, but I will. After securing the bandage, he moved on to inspect a shallow cut on her forearm and a bruise on her shoulder. His fingers were warm and steady as he applied ointment and small bandages where needed. Grace watched him quietly. There was a care in his touch she hadn't expected from someone, reputed to be dangerous. There, he announced softly, sticking the last bandage in place on a nick at her hairline she hadn't even noticed. All fixed up. Thank you, Grace said, meeting his eyes. For everything. Alexander's expression grew serious. You don't have to thank me. I'm the one who crashed your wedding and dragged you into a firefight. You saved me from walking into a trap, she replied. If you hadn't shown up, I would still be in that church, married to a man who was deceiving me and at the mercy of Conrad. I can't even imagine what they would have done. Her voice wavered, and Alexander's hands tightened into fists on his knees, as if the thought angered him deeply. I wasn't going to let that happen, he said, a hard edge briefly coating his words before softening again. It shouldn't have gone down like that. I should have been able to stop them before it got so far. Grace saw a flash of guilt cross his face. You did everything you could, more than anyone else did. She gingerly placed a hand on his forearm. We're here, alive. That's what matters right now. Alexander looked at her hand on him, then up to her eyes. There was a quiet intensity between them in that moment. Grace became aware of how close they were sitting. Time slowed as something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared danger, of reliance, of a bond forged in blood and trust so suddenly. Alexander cleared his throat and gently withdrew, standing up as if to put some distance before either of them did something impulsive. I'll, let you rest. We both need some sleep, even if only a little. It'll be a long day tomorrow, figuring out our next move. Grace felt a small pang as he stepped away, but she nodded. What will our next move be? His face darkened thoughtfully. First, we need to locate where Conrad took your father. I have some contacts looking into that. We also need those documents Conrad is after. If we can get them before he does, we'll have leverage. Grace frowned, trying to recall if her father had given her any hint. My father never told me about any evidence, but earlier today he was acting strange. Before the ceremony, he gave me a present. She looked toward where her discarded wedding dress lay crumpled. It was a locket that belonged to my mother. He said something about it being something old for the wedding and that I should keep it close. She remembered his eyes had been so full of sorrow and urgency when he clasped it around her neck. In the shock of everything, she'd forgotten it entirely. Grace shot up from the bed and went to the dress. She rummaged through the folds and found the delicate silver chain, tangled in the satin. The locket had fallen into the skirt's pocket. She pulled it out and held it up to the light. It was an antique silver locket, engraved with a tiny rose pattern, her mother's favorite flower. Grace's throat tightened at the sight. She tried to open it with trembling fingers. It was sealed shut in an unusual way, with no obvious hinge or clasp. Here, let me see, Alexander said gently, coming to her side. She handed it to him. He examined the locket for a moment, then pressed a spot on the side. With a soft click, it sprang open. Inside, instead of a photo, there was a tiny rolled piece of thin paper. Grace carefully took it out and unrolled it. Numbers and letters scrawled in her father's handwriting. An address in Rome and a numerical code. Beneath that, 2 words, Trust Knight. Grace's eyes filled anew reading her father's note. He had planned for the worst, it seems, leaving her a message and something to help, knowing Conrad might strike. And he wanted her to trust Alexander, Knight, explicitly. He must have truly believed in this man to stake her safety on him. Alexander read the note over her shoulder, his breath slightly warm near her ear. The address might be where your father hid the documents. That code could be a safe deposit box or a combination to a safe. We have to go get them, Grace said immediately, closing the locket and clutching it to her chest. Maybe if we have what Conrad wants, we can trade. Alexander's face was unreadable for a moment. Possibly, or we could use them to destroy him. Your father clearly trusted me to use whatever is there wisely. Grace turned to him, eyes earnest. I trust you too. The words left her mouth before she had fully processed them, but they were true. In the span of hours, Alexander had proven himself more than Ethan had in a year of courtship. He had saved her life, shown kindness, and promised to save her father. She had nothing but her trust to give in return. Alexander looked slightly taken aback. He opened his mouth to respond, but Thomas's voice outside the door interrupted. Boss, sorry to disturb, Thomas called. We have an update. Alexander moved to the door and opened it. What is it? Thomas glanced in at Grace as well, his face apologetic but urgent. We might have a lead on Mr. Miller, one of our informants. Says he was taken out of the city, possibly to Conrad's estate in the countryside, and Caldwell's put a bounty out for the capture of Ms. Miller. Grace felt a chill. A bounty on her. Conrad was hunting her like a prized trophy. She hugged her arms around herself. How much? Alexander asked, strangely calm. 500,000 euros, Thomas replied grimly. Dead or alive, but extra if alive. Grace's knees almost gave way. Money for her life, or corpse. It made her feel sick. Alexander's eyes flashed with lethal anger. He's desperate then. He knows she slipped through his fingers and that she might have the evidence or lead him to it. He glanced back at Grace. with a protective fire in his eyes. No one's touching her. Double the men on watch and activate our decoy plans. I want Caldwell chasing ghosts all over the country if possible. Thomas nodded. We already started some false leads through our channels, and Marcus is coordinating a few safe house moves in case. Grace stepped forward. We can't just hide and let him keep my father. She looked between them, heart pounding. We have to do something. Go after Dad or lure Conrad out. Something. We will, Grace, Alexander said firmly. But we have to be smart. We'll retrieve the evidence your father left. That's our best shot at turning the tables. With those documents, Conrad will be the one on the back foot. Thomas chimed in. We should head to Rome at first light. It'll be safer traveling by dawn when Caldwell's people are hopefully still scrambling. Alexander agreed. Let the team rest in shifts tonight, Thomas, and prepare 2 cars for the morning, unmarked. We'll leave early. As Thomas left, Grace realized with a start that Alexander intended to go, personally, to get those documents. You're coming with me to Rome? She asked. Alexander gave her a look that suggested the question was unnecessary. I'm not letting you out of my sight. Not until this is over. Something warm blossomed in Grace's chest at that. Though fear still gnawed at her for her father, she felt reassurance that with Alexander at her side, she stood a fighting chance. He must have noticed the fatigue and lingering distress in her face, for he gently placed a hand on her back to steer her toward the bed again. Try to rest for a few hours. I'll keep watch. Grace wanted to protest that he needed rest too, but she doubted she could sleep anyway with her nerves so frayed. Yet as soon as she sat and Alexander draped a soft blanket around her shoulders, exhaustion weighed on her. What about you? She murmured, wrapping the blanket around herself and looking up at him. He stood over her, strong and vigilant despite everything. I'll be fine, he said. I don't sleep much, and certainly not when danger is near. She bit her lip. On impulse, she reached out and lightly took his hand. Thank you for not leaving me alone. Alexander's fingers curled around hers briefly. I'll be right outside. Get some sleep, Grace. Reluctantly, she released him. As he moved toward the door, she found herself calling softly. Alex? He paused, turning back. The nickname slipped out naturally, even though she'd only ever heard others call him by his full name or boss. Grace managed a faint smile. Be careful, please. Hardened expression eased into the barest smile in return. I will. And with that, he stepped out, shutting the door but leaving it open a crack. Grace lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin, the locket still clutched in her hand. Despite her swirling thoughts, her body soon claimed the rest it desperately needed. Her eyes drifted closed to the distant sound of Alexander, quietly speaking to his men, organizing her rescue mission even as the stars wheeled through the night sky beyond the safe house walls. When Grace woke, the first pale blue light of dawn was seeping through the gap in the curtains. For a brief, blissful moment, she forgot where she was, half expecting to hear wedding bells or her father's laugh. But the throbbing ache in her heart and body quickly reminded her of reality. She sat up, the blanket falling away. Someone had placed a bottle of water and a note on the nightstand. She reached for the note, recognizing Alexander's neat handwriting. Went to check perimeter. Back in 10 minutes. Alex. Her lips curved at the fact he'd signed it with the same shortened name she'd used. She took a sip of water, then rose. Her muscles protested, stiff and sore, but she pushed through it. They had an important mission ahead. Finding a basic toiletry kit in the bathroom, she quickly washed her face and finger-combed, her hair back into a low ponytail with an elastic band she found. The woman in the mirror still looked tired and drawn, but determined. In the main room, she found Thomas and Ryan quietly chatting over a map spread on the table. They looked up and greeted her with polite nods and gentle good mornings. Mr. Knight is outside, he'll be right back, Ryan said. He said to make sure you got some breakfast. He gestured to the kitchen corner where a pot of coffee and some pastries were laid out. Grace wasn't hungry, but she forced herself to nibble a corner of a croissant and sip coffee for the caffeine. The villa was quiet in the dawn hush, but an undercurrent of tension thrummed. Marcus entered from the front door, some car keys in hand. He gave Grace a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She supposed not all of Alex's men had to be friendly. She was essentially a stranger who brought a lot of trouble with her. Cars are ready, Marcus reported. We should hit the road in the next 15. Thomas acknowledged. Ryan will stay here and coordinate intel. Marcus and I will accompany you and Miss Miller to Rome. Thank you all, Grace said earnestly. I can't express how grateful. Marcus held up a hand. No need. We're following our boss's orders, he said with a shrug. He wants you safe, so that's what we'll do. His tone wasn't rude, but it was perfunctory. Grace felt a slight awkwardness and went quiet, finishing her coffee. Just then, the door opened and Alexander strode in, early sunlight catching the slight stubble on his chin. He had changed clothes, now dressed in dark jeans, boots, and a black long-sleeve shirt that fit snugly across his broad chest. He looked every bit the dangerous wanderer. A shoulder holster peeked out from under his left arm, housing his pistol. Grace's eyes unintentionally lingered on how the outfit emphasized his physique. A flush warmed her cheeks, and she quickly averted her gaze as he approached. Morning, he said, his voice gentler when directed at Grace. Feeling all right? She nodded. Ready to go? He gave her an assessing look. We have a spare bulletproof vest. I'd like you to wear it under your sweatshirt, just in case. A vest. That really drove home how perilous this was. All right, she agreed quietly. Thomas fetched the vest and Grace stepped aside to put it on. It was bulky and heavy, but Alexander helped adjust the strap so it fit more snugly around her torso, beneath her sweatshirt. He then handed her a small handgun in a holster. This is for you, he said. Have you ever used one? Grace swallowed, taking the weapon carefully. No, never. His face was solemn. Let's hope you won't have to, but I want you to have a way to defend yourself. We may get separated or something could go wrong. Keep it on safety until you need it. Spent a minute quickly demonstrating how to click the safety off and on, how to aim and hold it properly. His hands guided hers in a no-nonsense lesson that, nevertheless, made her pulse, quicken being so close to him. Do you think something will go wrong? She asked as he finished, unable to hide the tremor in her voice. Alexander looked into her eyes. I plan as if it might. That's how we stay alive. But I'll do everything to prevent it. He gently squeezed her hand, that held the gun before releasing it. Remember, last resort only. Grace nodded. The idea of shooting someone made her ill. But after yesterday, she understood how real the threat was. In short order, the group was ready. It was decided Alexander and Grace would ride in one car driven by Marcus, while Thomas led in another car to scout ahead and divert if needed. Dawn blossomed into a peach-colored morning as they departed the villa. Grace sat in the back of the sedan with Alexander beside her again. Marcus drove, eyes flicking vigilantly to the rear-view mirror now and then. The plan was to head to Rome, a couple of hours away. They expected Conrad's reach could extend that far, but their early start and separate cars could help avoid detection. As they sped along countryside roads, Grace found herself absently fiddling with the locket around her neck, which she had put on after retrieving the note. Inside it now only remained a tiny photo of her mother that had always been there. She found strength in touching it, Alexander noticed. Your mother? He inquired softly. Grace smiled sadly. Yes, she died when I was 10. A car accident. Her smile faded. At least that's what I was always told. Alexander's jaw ticked. You think Conrad might have had something to do with it? She shrugged, looking out at the passing olive groves. I don't know. I never considered it until now, until I realized what kinds of monsters were around us. My father never talked much about the accident. It was a hit and run. They never found the driver. She was coming home from a late work meeting. Her voice had gone quiet. Maybe it truly was just an accident. Or maybe Conrad's been wrecking our lives, far longer than I knew. Alexander reached over and placed his hand over hers gently. If Conrad was responsible, we'll find out. And he'll pay for that too. There was such ferocity in the statement that Grace wondered if Alexander had his own ghosts of loss. She ventured carefully. Have you lost someone dear to you because of him? Marcus's eyes flicked up to the mirror as if curious for Alexander's response. Alexander was silent for a moment, gazing ahead. Grace was about to apologize for prying when he spoke, voice low. Not because of Conrad, no. But I have lost people. Enemies and violence took them from me. His hand unconsciously tightened on hers. It's why I don't take chances with those I care about. Those I care about. The phrase hung in the air. Grace wondered if she already counted among them after such a short, intense time. The warmth of his hand and the protectiveness he'd shown gave her hope that she did. She turned her palm to hold his properly. "I'm sorry," she said sincerely. He gave her a faint smile, though pain lingered in his eyes from whatever memory he had. "It was a long time ago, but thank you." Marcus cleared his throat softly from the front, perhaps uncomfortable with the personal turn or just keeping focus. Alexander gently let go of Grace's hand, seeming to slip back into leader mode. They continued mostly in silence for the next hour, the road smooth and nearly empty in the early morning. The radio occasionally crackled as Thomas in the lead car updated them that all was clear. Grace watched the scenery of rolling hills and distant farmhouses, but her mind was far ahead, wondering about her father's condition and what awaited them in Rome. Anxiety gnawed at her. Eventually, they approached the outskirts of the city. Marcus took a route avoiding major highways, zigzagging through smaller towns and back roads to avoid detection. It added time, but caution was worth it. They paused once at a gas station to refuel and stretch. Grace stepped out to use the restroom and caught a glimpse of a missing person. Flyer on a bulletin board. A young woman's face smiled in black and white with Italian text below. Grace's chest tightened. By now, news of her kidnapping might have spread through certain circles, possibly even media if someone leaked that the wedding was attacked. She hurried back to the car, fear creeping that someone might recognize her despite her dressed-down attire. Alexander noticed her agitation as she climbed in. "You okay?" he asked under his breath. "Just worried someone will connect me to yesterday," she whispered. "What if the police are looking for me too? Or the news? We have friends in the local police keeping things quiet for now," Alexander said. "Officially, they'll say it was a botched robbery at the wedding. Your disappearance won't be publicized. Immediately, likely framed as missing amidst the chaos. Conrad will want to keep things under wraps too to avoid law enforcement scrutiny. He'll pursue you in the shadows, not through police." His knowledge was oddly reassuring. He'd thought these things through. By late morning, they had reached Rome. The address on the note was in a quiet residential neighborhood, north of the city center. It turned out to be a small private bank building, possibly where safe deposit boxes were kept. Thomas parked nearby, and they all convened briefly on the sidewalk. It was decided that Alexander and Grace would go in with Marcus, while Thomas stayed with the vehicles to keep them ready for a fast exit. Grace felt her nerves spike as they entered the bank. It was a modest, old-fashioned place with marble floors and a single security guard by the door who barely glanced at them. To avoid drawing attention, they had left most weapons. In the car, Grace's small gun remained, concealed on her ankle under her loose pants. Alexander carried only a hidden knife, relying on his imposing presence. At the desk, an elderly banker greeted them. Grace presented the code from her father's note and said softly that she needed to access the box associated with it. The banker checked the code, verified her ID, luckily she had, grabbed her passport from her purse at the safe house, and then led her and Alexander, who she introduced as her husband to avoid questions, into a back vault area. Marcus stayed in the lobby, eyes sharp for any incoming trouble. Inside the hushed vault room, the banker unlocked a long metal drawer from the wall of safe deposit boxes. "Take your time," he said kindly, then left them alone in the privacy chamber. Grace's hands trembled as she pulled the drawer out and set it on the small table. Inside was a thick envelope sealed with tape and a USB flash drive taped to it. Written on the envelope was, "For Grace, love, Dad." Her throat clenched. Alexander rested a hand on her back gently. "This is it. Let's take it and go." Grace nodded. She slipped both the envelope and flash drive into the inner pocket of the jacket she had borrowed. She wanted to read it right away, but they had no time here. As they exited the vault, Marcus approached with a brisk stride. He spoke under his breath, tone urgent. "We have company. Black SUV across the street. Could be nothing, but likely Caldwell's men." Grace's stomach flipped. They thought they'd been discreet, but perhaps the bounty or spies had traced them after all. Alexander stayed outwardly calm.
"Walk, don't run."
"We go straight to the car." They left the bank and headed toward their parked vehicles a half block down. Thomas had already started the engines, anticipating trouble. Just then, the black SUV's doors opened and two burly men stepped out, eyes locked onto Grace's group. One shouted, "Hey, stop!" Definitely Caldwell's men. Grace's heart lurched. Marcus stepped between them and Grace, one hand reaching under his jacket. But Alexander was faster. He grabbed Grace's hand and together they sprinted for the car. Go, go! Alexander yelled to Thomas, who had been waiting behind the wheel. Gunshots cracked behind them, one pinging off the sidewalk as pedestrians screamed and scattered. Marcus pulled his own gun and fired a couple shots back to slow the goons. Grace and Alexander dove into the back of Thomas's car. Marcus, covering their retreat, ran to the second car where Ryan, the other driver, had already moved into the driver's seat. They screeched out of their parking spots separately. As Thomas's car peeled away, Grace craned around to see the pursuers. The black SUV roared after them, with at least one of the thugs likely calling in reinforcements. Marcus's car took a different street, likely to confuse the tail or flank them. Another high-speed chase ensued through the Roman streets, weaving around honking traffic and startled pedestrians. Grace's vest dug into her ribs as Thomas swerved hard to avoid a collision. Alexander had drawn a handgun, perhaps stashed in the car, and was turned in his seat, ready to fire if the pursuers got too close. Grace clutched the seatbelt, heart in her throat once more. Just like old times, eh? Thomas grunted as he swung them around a roundabout, tires squealing. The black SUV was still on them, though a bit behind. Then, from a side street, Marcus's car suddenly appeared, cutting in behind the pursuers. Marcus leaned out the passenger window and opened fire at the enemy vehicle's tires. The SUV skidded as one tire blew out, crashing into a parked car and grinding to a halt in a spray of sparks. Thomas whooped. Nice shot. Grace exhaled a shaky breath of relief as they sped away, leaving the wreck and any surviving thugs behind. They rendezvoused with Marcus's vehicle a few miles out at a truck stop off the highway. There, they quickly swapped vehicles and plates. Evidently, Alexander's team had contingencies. Soon they were back on the road towards the countryside where Conrad's estate supposedly was, now armed with the envelope of evidence. In the back seat, Grace finally opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were several pages of documents, financial statements, records of offshore accounts linking Conrad to illegal arms deals and drug money, plus a list of names, likely bribes or collaborators. One sheet made. Grace gasped. It was an autopsy. Report for Linda Miller, her mother, showing that her accident had forensic signs of tampering with the brakes. In other words, likely sabotage. Likely murder. Tears filled Grace's eyes as she realized her father had been quietly investigating her mother's death for years, and this evidence pointed to Conrad orchestrating it, probably because her mother discovered Conrad's crimes in his business and threatened to expose him. That's why Conrad had such a vendetta. Robert must have taken this evidence and gone into hiding in plain sight as a legitimate businessman. Oh my God, she whispered, hands shaking as she passed that sheet to Alexander. He killed my mother. Alexander's face went as dark as a thundercloud as he read. That son of a... He caught himself, lowering his voice. Grace, I'm so sorry. Fresh determination, fueled by grief and rage, coursed through Grace's veins. We have to make sure Conrad never hurts anyone else again. We have proof now of so many of his crimes. Alexander nodded firmly. We'll use this to get your father back and bring Conrad down. I promise. He carefully tucked the papers away again, patting Grace's shoulder comfortingly as emotion overwhelmed her. She steeled herself quickly. There would be time to mourn later. Now was for action. By early afternoon, they neared Conrad's estate, a sprawling vineyard and villa compound atop a hill. They stopped a few kilometers away to plan. Through binoculars, Alexander observed guards at the gated entrance and patrolling the grounds. It was heavily fortified. A frontal assault would be messy. They needed a way to get inside without a war. At this point, their group had been whittled to Alexander. Grace, Marcus, Thomas, and Ryan, the driver. 5 against who knew how many of Conrad's men. While they deliberated, Grace's phone, which she had retrieved from her purse, buzzed unexpectedly. It was a text from an unknown number. Grace, it's Ethan. I heard what happened. My father has your dad at the estate. I want to help you. Please believe me. Come to the old service gate on the east side at 3 p.m. I'll get you in. Grace's heart pounded as she read it aloud to Alexander and the team. Could be a trap, Marcus warned immediately. Thomas rubbed his chin. Or he could be sincere. If he wanted to lure her, he could just tell his father her location from earlier. But maybe guilt's eating at him. Grace felt a swirl of emotions at seeing Ethan's message. Anger, hurt, but also a glimmer of hope. If he truly wanted to make amends by saving her father, perhaps he wasn't beyond redemption. I think he might really want to help, she said quietly. He looked so horrified at the church. I could tell he didn't expect things to go that far. Alexander looked torn, clearly despising the idea of trusting Ethan, but also pragmatic. We should use any advantage. If Ethan can get us in quietly, that's better than storming the front gates. He fixed Grace with a firm look. But we'll go in armed and ready. One wrong move, and he won't get a second chance to betray us, Marcus finished, patting his rifle. They agreed to take up Ethan's offer, but cautiously. Marcus and Ryan would create a diversion on the opposite side of the estate to draw guards away at 3 p.m. Meanwhile, Alexander, Grace, and Thomas would approach the East Service Gate. As 3 p.m. approached, Grace's nerves felt stretched to the breaking point. They moved through rows of grapevines for cover. The sun beat down on the quiet afternoon, incongruous to the deadly tension. At precisely 3, distant pops sounded from the north side, Marcus initiating a distraction, perhaps sniping a guard or causing an explosion at the fence. Shouts in Italian echoed as Conrad's men reacted, many rushing that way. Alexander signaled and they dashed to the small service entrance on the east. It was a simple gate meant for deliveries, likely locked electronically. But as they arrived, the gate clicked and swung open. On the other side stood Ethan, pale and sweating, an assault rifle slung at his shoulder. He raised a finger to his lips. "Hurry," he whispered urgently. Grace stepped through with Alexander and Thomas flanking her. Guns drawn but lowered, she locked eyes with Ethan. It was a strange, sorrowful moment, seeing the man she had nearly married now as someone she had to be wary of. Ethan's eyes brimmed. "Grace, I'm so sorry," he breathed. She nodded curtly, keeping focus. "My father? In the wine cellar. Alive for now," Ethan replied, gesturing for them to follow through a side garden path. "We have to be quick. My father is furious and planning something for tonight. I think to force him to talk." They crept through a rear courtyard. Most of the guards had gone toward the disturbance. A couple remained by the house, but Ethan guided them around another way. Thomas hung back to secure their exit route, covering them from behind a stone wall. Alexander, Grace, and Ethan slipped into the villa through a back door that Ethan had apparently unlocked. Inside, the estate was lavish and eerily quiet. Distant shouting could be heard from outside where the diversion continued. Ethan led them downstairs. At one turn, they ran into a lone guard in the hall. The man's eyes widened at seeing Grace with Ethan and an unknown man. He reached for his radio. Alexander lunged, slamming the guard into the wall with a swift chokehold, rendering him unconscious in seconds. Grace stared, astonished at his lethal efficiency even without firing a shot. They reached a heavy door leading to the cellar. It was locked from outside with a deadbolt and padlock. Ethan produced a key and opened it. "He's in here." The door creaked open to reveal a dim cellar lined with wine barrels and crates. In the center, tied to a chair, was Robert Miller, bruised, his temple bleeding but very much alive. "Dad!" Grace cried, rushing to him. "Grace! Oh, thank God!" Robert's voice was raw but filled with relief. She carefully removed his gag and started working on the ropes, binding his wrists. Robert winced, arms stiff as the ropes fell away. Grace hugged him tightly, mindful of his injuries. Alexander kept watch at the door while Ethan nervously helped untie Robert's feet. "We need to move," Alexander urged. "Caldwell's likely to realize something soon if Marcus's diversion doesn't hold." Indeed, as if on cue, an alarm began, blaring through the estate. Someone had likely found the open service gate or realized intruders were inside. Ethan cursed. "He knows." "Then let's not be here," Alexander said. He tapped his radio. "Thomas, we have her father. Heading out now." A crackle. Then Thomas's voice. "Copy. The Hornets. Nest is stirred, though. Multiple. Tango's headed back your way, Alexander." Turned to Ethan, gaze cold. "We'll need to fight our way out. Are you with us, or was this all a ploy?" Ethan raised his hand slightly, face anguished. "I'm with you, I swear. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to make my father proud. And I did love Grace." His voice faltered, guilt-ridden. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but let me help fix this." Grace bit her lip, then nodded. "Okay." Alexander tossed Ethan a spare handgun. "Let's move. Cover the rear." They hurried back upstairs with Robert, leaning on Grace. He was weak but determined to walk. I can fight if you give me a gun, he rasped. I've got Dad, Grace insisted, tightening her hold around Robert's waist. Just focus on getting us out. She had drawn her small pistol as well, heart-hammering but resolved to use it if she had to. They emerged into the courtyard where they'd come in. Thomas joined them from his cover spot, picking off a guard who had nearly crept up on them. The path to the east gate was ahead, but voices shouted from that direction now, guards returning. Marcus's voice came on the radio. We are engaging heavy resistance out front. Get out now or you'll be surrounded. Alexander swore under his breath, making a split-second decision. Change of plans. We won't make the gate. Into the vines, we lose them in the fields and regroup at fallback point Bravo. They shifted course, heading into the rows of grapevines adjacent to the courtyard. As they dashed into the thick greenery, Conrad's men flooded the yard behind them, bullets whizzing. One clipped past Grace's ear and she yelped, ducking. Alexander fired back twice, dropping 2 pursuers, then pulled Grace and her father deeper into the vineyard. Ethan and Thomas returned fire at the guards, covering their retreat. The group moved in crouches through the vine rows, but a few guards had entered the fields to chase them. Suddenly, a figure stepped out ahead of them in the row. Conrad Caldwell himself, flanked by a bodyguard. The bodyguard leveled a rifle at the approaching fugitives. Conrad's face twisted in rage and triumph. Going somewhere, Knight? And taking my bride and her daddy? I don't think so. He noticed Ethan trailing behind with Thomas. Conrad's eyes flared at the sight of his son with the enemy. Ethan, you worthless! He raised a pistol at his own son. Traitorous son. Time slowed. Conrad fired at Ethan, but Robert, seeing the danger to the young man who, despite everything, had tried to save him, instinctively lunged forward and shoved Ethan aside. The bullet meant for Ethan struck Robert in the chest. No! Grace screamed as her father fell to his knees, blood spreading on his shirt. Everything erupted into chaos. Alexander roared in fury and unloaded 3 shots into Conrad's bodyguard, who dropped instantly. Ethan, shock on his face, raised the handgun Alexander had given him and fired at his father. Conrad took a hit to the shoulder, stumbling with a snarling cry. Grace, adrenaline surging, guided her collapsing, father gently to the ground and pressed her hands over the wound, tears blurring her vision. Dad, hold on, she sobbed. Robert coughed, blood on his lips, but managed a faint, pained smile at her. My baby, you're safe, thank God, he wheezed. Conrad, injured but not out, aimed his pistol at Grace and Robert, madness in his eyes. Before he could shoot, Alexander slammed into him with a ferocious tackle. Both men went down in the dirt between vine rows, the gun skittering away. They grappled fiercely. Conrad, though older, fought with vicious desperation, landing a strike on Alexander's wounded arm. Alexander grimaced but retaliated with a brutal punch to Conrad's face. Thomas and some guards exchanged gunfire nearby. It was hard to tell who had the upper hand as chaos reigned in the vineyard. Grace kept pressure on Robert's wound, sobbing, You're going to be okay, Dad, please. But the blood was pouring too fast. She was terrified. Ethan crawled to them, face ashen with remorse. Mr. Miller. Robert, I'm so sorry, he babbled, shrugging off his jacket to press on the wound as well. Robert gave a weak nod, perhaps an attempt at forgiveness in his final moments. A sudden crack rang out, Marcus's sniper rifle from afar. A guard aiming at them fell, headshot. Marcus was providing cover from a distance as he closed in. Alexander and Conrad rolled on the ground, wrestling for dominance. Conrad managed to seize a rock and smashed it against Alexander's side, making him grunt and loosen his hold. Conrad scrambled for his dropped pistol a few feet away, his fingers nearly on it. Grace saw the imminent threat to Alexander. Without hesitation, she snatched up her own gun that lay beside her father and fired at Conrad. Her shot hit Conrad in the arm just as he grabbed the pistol, causing him to yelp and drop it. Alexander seized the moment. He lunged up, grabbing Conrad's own fallen pistol, and trained it on the older man. Breathing hard, Alexander's face was a mask of rage and triumph. Don't move, he snarled. Conrad, clutching his bleeding arm, glared hatefully but froze. Around them, the fight was dying down as Conrad's men either lay dead, fled from Marcus and Thomas's onslaught, or surrendered when they saw their boss at gunpoint. It's over, Alexander said in a deadly quiet tone, looming over Conrad. You lost. Conrad spat at him, eyes wild. You think this changes anything? You're just another criminal, Knight. Kill me or not, someone will always take my place. Alexander's jaw clenched, finger twitching on the trigger. Grace feared he might execute him right there. And part of her wanted that. For all Conrad had done, but another part remembered the evidence they had gathered. Better to see him rot in prison, all his power stripped away. Sirens wailed in the distance now. Local authorities, likely alerted by the gunfire or Marcus's explosion. Their own friendly contacts on the force might be coming to clean up. Grace stayed on the ground cradling her father, even as medics gently tried to take him. Alexander eventually eased her away so they could attempt first aid. Though it was too late, he enveloped her in his arms as she trembled and sobbed into his chest. The sun dipped low, casting golden light over the vineyard that had become a battleground. In that glow, Grace clung to the only solid thing left in her life, Alexander. The days that followed were a blur. There were police statements, hospital visits, and arrangements for her father's body to be brought home. News outlets buzzed with reports of business mogul Conrad Caldwell's arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and murder. The evidence Robert had safeguarded, now in prosecutors' hands, was making national headlines. Through Alexander's connections, Grace's role in the takedown remained low profile. Officially, she was a victim pulled from the chaos, not a vigilante participant in a vineyard shootout. Ethan's involvement was also downplayed. He cooperated with authorities, corroborating the crimes and accepting the consequences for his own part. When Grace spoke to him briefly during the legal proceedings, he broke down apologizing. She found to her own surprise that she forgave him. His betrayal hurt, but he had tried to make it right in the end. And her father had believed in forgiveness enough to save his life. It felt like what her father would want. A week later, back in the United States, Grace stood at her father's graveside under a gray, drizzling sky. A small gathering of family friends and colleagues huddled under black umbrellas. As the pastor finished speaking, Grace barely heard the words, her heart aching with grief. She wore a simple black dress and clutched a white lily, one of her father's favorite flowers. When the service concluded, the mourners drifted away with gentle condolences and promises to check on her soon. Eventually, only Grace and Alexander remained by Robert's grave, the headstone still bare until it could be engraved. Alexander stood quietly beside her, a steady presence. He had flown back with her and supported her through every painful step of this farewell. Now he held a single white lily of his own, one he had retrieved from the wreckage of her bridal bouquet, somehow still intact. Kneeling, Alexander placed the lily on the fresh mound of earth and bowed his head. Grace's throat tightened. Alexander hadn't known Robert long, but he seemed to understand what a great man he was, and Robert had seen something in Alexander, enough to entrust him with her life. As the drizzle turned heavier, Grace shivered. Alexander immediately slipped off his long coat and draped it around her shoulders, shielding her from the chill. She looked up at him with gratitude. The raindrops caught on his dark lashes and peppered his black suit. But he didn't seem to notice. His entire focus was on her. "You should go," Grace said softly. "You'll catch cold." "I'm fine," he murmured, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. "I'm more worried about you." Grace managed a small smile. In truth, the rain was the last thing on her mind. A hollow emptiness filled her now that her father was gone and the adrenaline of survival had subsided. She felt unmoored and alone, despite the justice achieved. But she wasn't truly alone, was she? Tentatively, she reached out and took Alexander's hand. "I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you," she said, voice trembling. "You've done so much for me. And for Dad. Thank you." Alexander gently squeezed her hand. "You don't have to thank me. I wish I could have saved him too." His voice was rough with regret. "He was a good man. He thought the world of you." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, sliding down her cheeks. "It's all so unfair," she choked. "He should be here, celebrating that monster getting locked away. He should—" Her voice broke. Alexander immediately pulled her into his arms. She pressed her face against his chest, sobs shaking her. The rain fell harder, but in his embrace she felt warmth and shelter. He rubbed soothing circles on her back, letting her cry. After a long moment, Grace's tears subsided to sniffles. She realized she was clutching fistfuls of Alexander's shirt. Embarrassed, she loosened her grip, but Alexander held her firmly, not ready to let go. Through the patter of rain, his voice rumbled softly above her. "Grace, When you're ready, I'd like you to come with me. I have an estate upstate. It's quiet, surrounded by woods, very private and safe. You can take all the time you need to heal, and I'd be there, if you want me. The normally confident Mafia boss sounded almost shy asking this. Grace tilted her head back to look at him. His steel-gray eyes searched hers earnestly. He was offering her a haven, but more than that, he was asking her to stay in his life. Her heart, bruised but still capable of love, fluttered. In the crucible of danger and loss, they had forged a bond neither had expected. She thought of all the layers she'd seen in Alexander, the ruthless fighter, the gentle caretaker, the man carrying his own scars quietly. He understood her pain, and she understood his. With him, she felt safe, cherished, and yes, even loved. She reached up and cupped his cheek, feeling the hint of stubble beneath her palm. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," she whispered. Relief broke across Alexander's face. He wrapped his hand over hers on his cheek, turning to press a tender kiss to her rain-cool palm. "You mean that?" "I do," Grace said softly, realizing the irony of saying those words a week, after a wedding that never truly was. This time, she meant them with every fiber of her being. Alexander's gaze flickered with emotion, joy tempered by the sorrow around them. He leaned in slowly, giving her plenty of time to stop him. She didn't. Her eyes drifted shut as his lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle and reverent at first, then deepened with all the pent-up longing and passion that had been building between them. Grace rose on her toes, her free hand winding around the back of Alexander's neck as she kissed him back with equal fervor. For the first time in what felt like forever, warmth and light blossomed inside her. The rain swirled around them, but she barely felt it. When they finally drew apart, both were breathing a little unsteadily. Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Grace," he confessed quietly, the words filled with tenderness and conviction. It felt like he'd been holding them back until just this moment. Grace's heart swelled. Amidst so much tragedy, this love had taken root. Unexpected. Intense and all the more precious. "I love you too, Alex," she whispered, voice hitching with happiness, even as tears mingled with the raindrops on her face. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, a sound of pure contentment. Gently, he wiped her tears and rain away with his thumbs, then kissed her once more, a soft promise on her lips. In that moment, Grace felt her father's presence, as if Robert were watching and smiling, finally at peace knowing she was safe and loved. She closed her eyes and silently thanked him for leading Alexander to her. For trusting him. Alexander drew her into a warm embrace, his coat wrapped around them both now, shielding them from the chill. "We should go," he murmured after a while, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You've had enough of standing in the rain for one day." Grace nodded, but before leaving, she knelt briefly to touch her father's headstone. "Goodbye, Dad," she whispered. "I'll make you proud. I promise." Then she rose and allowed Alexander to guide her away. Hand in hand, they walked from the gravesite. The future was uncertain, as life always is, but they would face it together. The tragedy they had endured would not be the end of Grace's story. It would be the beginning of a new chapter, one written side by side with the man who had become her unexpected savior and the love of her life. As they reached the cemetery gates, Grace glanced up at Alexander. He looked back at her with a small smile before lifting her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. Despite all the darkness they had survived, in his eyes she saw hope and a promise of brighter days ahead. Together they stepped forward into the world beyond, two souls bound by fate, forged in danger, and determined to carve out their own happiness from the wreckage. Whatever came next, they would face it arm in arm, proving that love, even born amid bullets and betrayal, could grow stronger than fear, and that from tragedy could bloom a love powerful enough to last a lifetime.